Okay, and with that, we'll move on to the Q&A portion of our presentation today. So first, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Mara Letterman, who is the site lead for CDL-Toronto and a professor of strategic management at the Rotman School of Management. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists for today, Umair Akeel, product architect at Twilio, Patricia Thaine, co-founder and CEO of Private AI, and Gillian Hadfield, the director of the Schwartz Reisman Institute and a professor of law and professor of strategic management at the University of Toronto. And with that, Mara, I will hand it over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Zach. And thanks to Patricia, Gillian, and Umair for joining me today. Gillian, I want to start off with you. We're going to talk a lot today about responsible AI. It's a term we hear a lot. There's a lot of buzz. Can you give us a sense of what do people mean when they throw around this term responsible AI?
So responsible AI gets used in a lot of different contexts, and people are grasping at what it means. There's a common understanding that it refers to making sure that AI is doing what we want it to do and not causing harm. But when we drill down a little bit more, people are talking about fairness, so that it's not discriminating against people, that it's fair to people, that it's not biased against particular groups, that it's transparent. There's also, of course, great concerns about privacy and the management of all the data that is being used to build AI systems. I also think it's important to think about responsible AI as being accountable, right? So if we're getting automated decision making, how do we make sure that those decisions are following the rules that humans have to follow when we make them? So there's a lot of things under the umbrella. We're all having a lot of conversations about what it means, and I think one of the real challenges is to actually drill down and start to say, okay, now what do you really mean that means? But that's how people use the term.
Okay, that's really helpful. And what's taking place in terms of market forces and regulatory forces that have brought this issue of responsible AI to the forefront today?
So there's a lot of discussion about standards. So I think last count, there's probably 150, 170 sets of guidelines, principles for ethical AI that have been developed by governments and civil society groups and corporations globally. So that's the nature of the conversation. There's clearly, and then we get kind of, bad things that happen. So you find out that there's algorithms being used in the criminal justice sector and they're discriminating against people of color, or that lending algorithms are discriminating. We're finding out that there's these black box systems that are being used to allocate medical or healthcare resources. So those kinds of concerns are sort of, like Canada, for example, 3/4 of corporations have ethical AI committees in them. So it's definitely something that's hitting the corporate sector. But then what we're finding is that it's causing a certain amount of paralysis in corporations, because they're saying, well, but we don't know, what does it mean for AI to be fair? How will we know? That's creating a demand for solutions. Governments are starting to step in, but we're still at a very early stage of figuring out how to drive that forward.
Okay, and you've gone on the record in some of your research in your own writing with the view that these solutions are, first of all, going to be technology solutions. This is not going to be inspectors, human inspectors, going around to companies and verifying whether their AI is acting responsibly in the dimensions you talked about. So number one, it'll have to come from technology because these things are so complicated, and that it's preferred if these solutions actually come from third parties, from startups, and not necessarily from the existing tech incumbents. Talk a little bit about why you have conviction that this is the way, these types of problems will need to be solved.
Yeah, so AI systems and machine learning based systems, they're operating at such scale with such a rapid speed of innovation, levels of complexity, global reach, that there's just no way that our pen and paper approaches from the past are going to keep up. So you're going to need technology to help regulate technology. And that's something that requires us to figure out how we're going to create the demand for that technology and how we're going to make sure that technology is aligned with what our politically accountable governments and so on want to see. What we're seeing right now is, companies that are building these systems are responding. They're responding internally if they're big enough. All of our big technology companies have, significant groups within them that are trying to work on how do we make sure that our content recommendations on the news feed are not, fostering conspiracy theories or putting out harmful content? How can we figure out whether or not how to test our algorithms internally? I think one of the key moves we need to see is getting more of that work, that technology work, into an independent sector. So one, that's available to all of our different companies at different scales, and two, because it shouldn't be part of what's hidden inside the company you're trying to regulate, I think. So I think we need to get some of that into an independent sector.
Okay, and so that sets up Patricia really nicely. And Patricia, you're the CEO of Private AI. You are a startup trying to do exactly what Gillian talked about. Set the stage, tell people a little bit about what Private does and also your own background so people understand how your company has emerged from your academic work and your co-founder's work.
That's great, thank you, Mara. So I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, and my research is on privacy preserving natural language and spoken language processing. And a couple of years ago, we realized that there's just this really massive gap in the market where if you wanted to integrate privacy into your software, it was a very difficult thing to do. Either you needed a background in secure multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption, machine learning plus privacy, all things which require specialization, are rare skills, are expensive to hire for. And a lot of the times companies that are dealing with privacy issues don't want to take their core engineers away from their core product to focus on creating privacy solutions. And these people often don't necessarily have the expertise to create good solutions for the problem. So what we decided to do is create Private AI, which makes it super easy for developers to integrate privacy into their pipeline with only a few lines of code. And the first thing that we're offering in this space is our de-identification toolkit for text, images, and video, and also pseudonymization toolkit for text, where you could replace names with fake names, locations with fake locations, so that you could then use that data for machine learning. And we are already in production in various systems, for example, for redacting phone call transcripts, for redacting chatbot messages that you're sending to third parties for analysis, internal sharing of documents and other data that otherwise you wouldn't be able to get to your machine learning teams. So it's been a very interesting journey.
And before we push more on your company and your experience in the CDL program, on this call or watching this video, I expect we have lots of people who are like you, PhD students doing groundbreaking research and maybe trying to decide whether or not there is something to commercialize. Just talk people through, at what point did you start your PhD knowing you wanted to build a company? At what point did you say, wait a minute, there's something here? Did you see the problem out there and say, hey, the thing I'm researching can solve that? CDL is all about commercializing university-based science. So many of our founding teams are like yourself. When did that light bulb around commercialization happen for you?
Yeah, so after I finished my master's, I was trying to decide whether I'd do a PhD or go into startup land. And my PhD advisor said, you don't have to choose. You could start a company while you're doing your PhD. He became a co-founder of the company as well and has been very supportive throughout. So that's been very helpful. And the research started out being on acoustic forensics. So determining who's speaking in a recording, what their educational backgrounds are, what their socioeconomic backgrounds are, all to make speech recognition work better. But some of the interest we were getting was from including heads of military from less than humanitarian countries. So we decided to look into, since this is processing some of the most sensitive information that we produce, how can we make it so that people's data is not misused? And we started looking at combining NLP with homomorphic encryption. It started version 1.0 of Private AI, where we combined homomorphic encryption with NLP, but the world was not ready for that yet.
And any advice you can give to other PhD students who might be working in one of these, doing research that's relevant to privacy or, algorithmic bias or justifiability and explainability of models, and what steps they should go through to even decide whether they want to commercialize or to assess the market opportunity for what they're working on?
Mm-hmm. So the biggest thing, the biggest difference between research and commercialization is that for research, you can start with a hammer and then start finding the nails. For commercialization, you need to start with the nail and then build a hammer around it. And your research may be a core part of that hammer, It might be slightly tangential to that hammer, but it might not even be related to that hammer, but you might still enjoy the topic. So the best thing to do is talk to a lot of people, have hypotheses that you're testing all the time, and be very flexible. So if it turns out to be very different from what you originally thought it would be, that's fine.
Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about the program. Describe, I would say, the journey or the transition that Private went through. You came to the program late October. Last week, we just had you at Super Session. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, but that's not a lot of time. And what are some of the key the key changes you would say your company went through as a result of participating in our program?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was actually very transformational. So one thing is early adopters. So the program has been able to give us several early adopters. Another thing is the mentorship. The mentorship's been great, including from Umair, really thinking about how to build a SaaS company, how to build a developer-focused SaaS company is something that as researchers, we didn't necessarily have experience in. And being able to understand what the key hires should be, how to frame the product, how to experiment in the marketing, things like that.
Okay, and last week, and then we're going to go to Umair in just a couple minutes, and then I'll throw a few things at all three of you. But last week we just had Super Session, and Super Session is when we bring together all of the graduating ventures from all 10 we're now up to 10, so all 10 CDL sites, and an opportunity to not just get in front of the mentors like Umair, who we've worked with all year, but the mentors from all of the other sites. And your company, Private, was one of our main stage companies, meaning you got in front of everybody who was there on the AI day. Just talk a bit about the scale of the reactions and the responses you got from the broader CDL community. And, if you could highlight one or two things that you think came out of that day last week.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So it was a flood of messages to respond to afterwards, including from more companies that wanted access to our product, including from mentors who wanted to help out with our asks like hiring, how to do hiring diversely, what the hiring plan should be like. So it's just there's a lot of generosity in the room, and also a huge list of people who would like to keep in touch for future fundraising rounds as well, which is always helpful.
Fantastic. And Umair, let's turn to you now. So Umair, remind me, how many years have you been at CDL Toronto?
I think more like 5 or 6. Yeah.
6 years. So before we jump to Patricia and your views on why we need a stream in specifically this area, what keeps bringing you back?
Other than the poutine truck outside of Rotman, which I do miss in this year of COVID, it's working with the extremely smart people who have PhDs, who are so dedicated on kind of their mission, and helping them with kind of the general understanding I have, which is of just, here's how you build software. So like working with specialists, building software, attacking big problems.
Okay, and so a little bit about your background, just to put your comments in context, and a bit about Twilio as well.
Yeah, so my background, been an engineer for about 20 years, been lucky enough to be doing SaaS in that entire 20-year period, worked at various startups, got acquired by large companies, worked at various large companies. Currently, I am a product architect at Twilio. Twilio is a developer-first B2D company focusing on communication APIs, so SMS, voice messaging, and just basically providing developers with the tools to build what they want to build for their companies.
Okay, and so that's a great perspective to weigh in on some of the things Gillian talked about at the beginning. Through your role at Twilio and the services you're trying to enable for your developer community, where do you see these issues around privacy and bias and explainability, either constraining what enterprises could and would like to do with the data they have?
Yeah, and I think Gillian brought up all the points. So we at Twilio have a responsible AI working group that consists of members from the architecture, from the technology, from the go-to-market, and from the legal and compliance team. So we really try and bring numerous functions under one umbrella to focus on what does it mean for us to be using AI to deliver our services, And what does it mean for us to be giving tools to our customers? And it's a number of the same things, setting the high bar on basically living by the principles of fairness, being careful not to do things where it can be either unethical or unlawful in terms of bias, being transparent with how we use our data. So these are things that we do. And I think the most important thing is this is rapidly evolving. We're trying to learn from lots of other colleagues across the technology ecosystem on how to just do this better.
Okay. And so when you met Patricia early in the program, and I know you mentored her multiple times, of all the companies you met in AI this year, why was this the one, and why was she the founder and her mission the one that spoke to you?
I think 3 reasons. First of all, if there was a hammer being built, Patricia comes with a sledgehammer, and so walls don't basically stop her. The curiosity, the perseverance, the follow-up, these are really important things as I look at founders. Because as you said, this is a difficult journey, and you have to be willing to be flexible. You have to be willing to take lots of input from lots of different people. And I definitely saw that in Patricia and the team. And the second one was, it was an unbundled solution to a really hard problem. The idea that you can use an API to solve a privacy problem without being part of some other bigger ecosystem, some existing technology provider that gives me data or cloud or whatever you have. And the third one, which might be kind of controversial, was in all my conversations with Patricia, we never talked about machine learning and models. It was always about a thoughtful view on the data collection, on the data verification, on the quality of the output. Not that I have this model and that model. And I think for folks working in AI, that's really important. Solve the customer problem. Don't worry about the technology you're solving for the customer problem, although it's there.
And so, I mean, that's great. It's great to hear. It's so rare, I think, that founders and mentors get to sort of speak freely like this with and to each other. So it's great to hear your reactions. Talk to me a little bit about the fit you see between what CDL does, and our program really well, right? We're here to build massively scalable companies that are based on deep science. Many of our founding teams coming out of universities, and the types of problems we're trying to solve with our focus in this stream on responsible AI and our partnership with the Schwartz Reisman Institute. Where do you see the overlap? I mean, why is it that CDL is going to help more companies like Patricia's achieve what we're all hoping they'll be able to achieve?
I think it's the diversity of input, right? So you have in a room people like Gillian and Patricia who are experts in their field, but then you've got an entire panel of people coming from such a diverse background that we're all bringing our opinions, the marketplace for our opinions, right? It's an open sharing of sometimes quite contrarian opinions. In this field, as we're trying to figure out what responsible AI actually means, what are the right tools for companies to use, I think there's a lot of value in that diversity of input. That to me is the most important one.
I'm glad you emphasized that. I'm going to just double down on that because I think one of the things that makes CDL unique as a mentorship program is exactly the diversity of backgrounds and perspectives that we assembled in our room. And so we have academics like Gillian who are at the forefront of the research in a particular area. We have people like you who have built multiple, in your case, multiple SaaS businesses. We have people who are leading AI teams, for example, inside banks. We had a few of those who are potential customers. We have, a 33-year, veteran of McKinsey who could speak from a broad set of, industry backgrounds at how customers might view these problems. We have other scientists who can advise Patricia on the technology. And so just that diversity of views and the different forms of input people can provide at different points in time is something that we consider to be one of our differentiating factors. I've got a question I'm going to throw out to all 3 of you, and maybe I'll go to you first, Umair, just because we're starting, and then I'll come to Patricia and then to Gillian. This question of whether responsible AI is just a compliance issue, and are enterprises only interested in it to kind of mitigate risk and deal with compliance, or about whether it's really going to open up new use cases of AI and new revenue streams, is one I hear a lot about. Where do you land on that? So we'll go Umair, Patricia, Gillian.
I think across the industry, for some companies, it will primarily be a compliance issue. Probably some legacy companies might look at it as a compliance issue first. But I think we need to look at it in a more innovative way in terms of when you think about the data in a more responsible way, you can actually think of a different type of service. I think it's similar to any other technology. Some people will use it for just checking the box. Some people will see the opportunity it provides. And I think we're early on. I don't know which way the majority will move. I'm hoping we move towards the innovation side.
Okay, fantastic. Patricia, and what are you hearing from your customers on this question?
Yeah, actually, I would say a very small amount contact us specifically for compliance. A lot of the times it's my customers want to share data with me, don't want me to have the PII in the data. Can you help? And that's much more of an opening revenue streams, opening the product for more innovation around the data that they're collecting. And in some cases, it is also so that they can, for their own peace of mind, not so much for compliance purposes, but so that they can protect their company from hackers, for example. They could de-identify data before they're storing it. And that, in that sense, they scrap away a lot of the risk that they would otherwise have had.
Okay, fantastic. And Gillian, please.
Yeah, so if by compliance we mean sort of existing regulations and, you know, like banking, money laundering, or whatever, so it's definitely a compliance component here. But I think it's much broader, and that may be also why the language of responsibility has appeared here. So it's hooking into corporate responsibility, social responsibility. We have investors that are saying, you know, sort of in the environmental, social, and corporate governance area, ESG investors who are screening companies for how well are your systems complying here. It's an employee matter. You have workforces that are saying, look, I don't want to work at a company that's producing irresponsible AI or is using data in privacy intrusive ways or contributing to bias, or we don't want to build facial recognition technology for police, right? So we have all of that happening around. So I think it's much, much broader than sort of a narrow regulatory compliance, like only your compliance and legal department's going to be in. I think it's company-wide, and it's evolving in a massive sense. So also, if you think you mean by compliance existing regulatory requirements, this is moving so fast. And we are definitely going to be seeing, you know, much broader expectations about what it means to be responsible with AI. So I think there's unlocking the capacity to say we can be out in front of this. And it's a little bit like, you know, if you figured out how to build the safer car before the regulations came in, right? You have that market advantage to that you're out in front and you're setting the standards, you're setting that competitive framework.
Okay, and talk a little bit, Gillian, about the institute you lead. You know, we're really excited that CDL and Schwartz Reisman now have a partnership. It's new, you know, these types of partnerships within the university. And just talk a little bit about what you guys do, the thought leadership you provide, and why you're keen to work with us on building startups in these areas.
Yeah, and we are very excited about this. So Schwartz Reisman Institute of Technology and Society, we're generally committed to making sure that AI and other powerful technologies are good for humanity. They're producing benefit and they are not producing harm. So that's very broadly based. We have a research function, so we have some of the top researchers doing the research across the board: computer science, political science, law, biology, philosophy. We're trying to integrate all of those. We also do some policy work, but I think what's really distinctive and why we're so excited about CDL is that we're very focused on solutions. So I mentioned at the beginning, there's lots and lots of conversation at very high abstract levels about what we mean by responsible AI. And where I'm seeing a real gap in the landscape is actually figuring out how to do that. How are you actually going to make sure this stuff is good for people? And that's also why we're very focused on regulatory technologies and the the exciting vision for me with CDL is, okay, we want to build massive companies. I want to build the sector of regulatory technology. And I think that's a combination of how do you figure out the smart legal requirements you want to put in place, as well as how do you drive the investment into building these technologies? Because I think that's where our real solutions are. They're not going to happen in government alone or created internally. Patricia talked beautifully about how, within the organization that's producing the AI systems, right, may not be the best use of their resources to be trying to figure out how to make them safe. Let's get that into independent companies, and that's why I think there's a whole sector available here.
Yeah, and we are similarly focused on solutions, building companies and building sectors. So it is I think going to be a very fruitful partnership. Just before we wrap, Patricia, I want to give you the last word. What's the long-term vision of your company? What do you hope to be? 5 years, we bring you back. 10 years, we bring you back. Tell me what Private's done.
Sounds good. So everything that we build has 4 key components: accuracy, efficiency, ease of integration, and generalizability. And with that in mind, what we're aiming to become is the Twilio of privacy. So the go-to solution for developers whenever they want to integrate privacy into their pipelines.
Fantastic. And since I didn't prep you with that question, I know that you didn't come up with your Twilio of privacy in advance. So I have every reason to believe you'll do it. Thanks, everybody. This was a fantastic conversation. Zach, back to you.
If you have questions, also please feel free to reach out to us at ai@creativedestructionlab.com. We'd be happy to get in touch with you and speak one-on-one to answer any questions you may have about the program.